Hello everyone, today we talk again about free companies. This is actually not the second part of the recent video on the companies of the 100 Years' War. This is one of the many repeated, I would say, coincidences from the cycle that proposes us randomly similar topics, however, from different perspectives, and obviously topics that are quite big. And in the case of the free companies, I think I've never really addressed just per se. Like, yes, we made lots of videos about different, say, periods, also properly military history encompassing the free companies. But it's important to frame them even better for understanding better how modern armies were actually created out of it. You start from this idea of almost anarchy, of chaos, during the mid-14th century crisis. But as we often observed, differently from antiquity, the medieval civilization, while shrinking by taking this very heavy hit, did not actually give way and actually continued. It even strengthened in some core fundamentals that will live on until the end of the Ancien Regime. And that's why this topic is actually so important, because we can photograph this passage, this moment of rebalancement that was necessary within medieval armies after a crisis that had really shattered the political and social foundations of a pretty big, as you know, in fact, universally tending system that was reshaped through even the same army's organization, but not all. When we talk about free companies, we also speak of so many different military realities. It's an umbrella term, if anything, that passes from the sort of freebooters, mortiers, aside from today's timeline that is fundamentally the 15th century, even the rebalancing, then later the Condottieri, probably the indenture system. Every country, let's say, had this kind of mercenary warfare, which is a term that I don't really like, in the sense that the term mercenary is often loaded with some negative bias of sort that does not render justice actually to the continuous say military professionalism of such freelancers, if you want, of warfare that, however, had really existed in the same way since ever and would keep existing down the line, even as sort of the bulk. And fundamentally, this is true for these companies at the end of the day until the mid-17th century. That by that point, we don't consider mercenaries more than much. Our idea of mercenarism is, again, the aforementioned Brabançon or the Condottieri or the Reisläufer or the Landsknechten. We do not see, or we do not want to see, for some cultural or subcultural reason, how this form of free professional soldiery was really a fundamental element of all military systems from antiquity to these very days, by the way. And we can start from, in fact, so many different topics. There are, by the way, some mercenary war bands that are really roaming around without any specific purpose, a bit lost, and mostly, in fact, get nowhere, especially at this time in history where civilization, we just recalled, was actually pretty robust and not really scared by them, to much more highly integrated statal systems like the Condottieri in Italy in particular, like in the 15th century, that really become the official military, so to say, of some of the, of course, the largest powers in Europe at the time. All of this cannot be treated today. Again, I have a playlist that is dedicated to mercenary warfare, if anything, because people are going to search for it, so I created it even if I don't like the term. But in fact, it's something we should start reasoning about in sort of much broader terms. Reason for which today we will look at various aspects, in particular, say, dispelling some myths about the moral unreliability of mercenaries from one side, that is a very hard to die myth, and also how they contributed to the foundation of de facto permanent armies, or at least the core of the same that had already profiled itself exactly from the crisis of the 14th century, unsurprisingly so. Today we will talk about fundamentally the Condottieri and the French companies, the Compagnies d'Ordonnance. I made multiple videos about the French army at this period, including the genesis of the companies, not just specifically the Compagnies d'Ordonnance. Made videos just about them. At some point we talked also about the Burgundian military, the Francs Archers. We talked about also early modern French warfare. That is something that partially connects with today's topic. So let's simply look at this and let's strengthen, in fact, the content already made on the subject. Now, it should be noted that for those of us living today, there are immortal people, of course, out there. That's a different story. Placing excessive trust in anecdotalism, in historiography, and in general in pop culture, it's particularly common, as I was already hinting at before, to have a negative bias against the mercenary per se. In part, this is a humanistic reaction to an objectively unregulated time in history, as surely the mid-14th century crisis and its consequences had brought during those generations. Had been, of course, many tumultuous periods in which similar things had happened, even worse ones, but also the spirits were really different. Like, it's different how you look at so-called mercenaries if you are, for example, in a dramatically expansive phase, civilizationally speaking, or in fact a contracting one. So, tendentially, there's a positive bias for those at the beginning and a negative one later. This is true if you really read the entire sort of European literature of the era. But of course we have such important names like Petrarch, so the same founder of humanism that at some point witnesses the decadence in fact the very darkest age. I mean, Petrarch lives throughout the great part of the 14th century, just like other figures connected with him, for example, Charles IV of Bohemia, that I made a video recently about, that in this sense we can appreciate, respectively, from a literary and a political, even imperial point of view, regarding how to manage the crisis, which I would say is a very important topic to be aware of today, at least from a historical point of view, to cultivate in terms of political culture. Because our first attitude, especially after greatly expansive phases, let's say, it's obvious to, as I was saying before, having a positive bias towards things, and then when this sort of sin is exposed, to immediately lose it, because we do not have sort of the moral antibodies to stem that kind of, oh my God, we were wrong, we did something. But crisis times are actually very interesting and very, very useful in a sense, because they can, first of all, rekindle us with things that really actually work, but they also just teach us from a moral point of view to differentiate what matters from what doesn't, right? Political noise, for example, look at the media today, etc. Like, it's always about, oh my God, everything that happens is overly dramatized, right? And overly emotionally represented, distorted, shouted, whatever. But the more, in a sense, even that, like, the more you're exposed to that and the more you make a reality check, the more you realize that in many ways, and as you know, this is an interpretation that I strongly have for the same late Middle Ages, but eventually civilization lives on, right? Especially when it has very, very solid fundamentals. And this kind of sort of attemptively scaring practice to impress the weak, for sure, but maybe work, especially when in a moment of fluidity people have sort of softened up, and so they're so vulnerable in that way. But especially if you have a pugnacious character and you're very open, you're very interested in what happens, and you have the consistency, the conscience to wanting to navigate in this troubled waters, you realize that maintaining control, right, maintaining the helm in this situation is actually incredibly educational and exemplificative how we shouldn't really be bothered more than much by what happens around, because most of it's sort of made up, and what we can control still should be the focus. It's not like the crisis does not exist, but this can be controlled, as opposed to say, okay, well, so let's finish off our same boat, let's sink it all together, so it's over, because we just can't handle ourselves and we're just a bunch of Phrenestanics. So even when reading Petrarch or Machiavelli, that later is a bit the most responsible voice for the creation of this negative mercenary myth, has from one side, yes, created a barrier to grasping historical reality for us today, but in fact it's not really what even these authors at the time were actually expressing. At least the reasons why they would express that, sometimes actually very validly, are to be contextualized in the, of course, reality of the time, and what, and especially the political interest. Why were these specific individuals attributing a negative bias to mercenaries? That's something that, by the way, we're not going to discuss per se today. Of course, the ultimate ideal, which is also one of the few Clausewitzian aspects that are at least correctly understood out there in the criticism of the Prussian, is that ideally, of course, an army should be something approximating to like a modern one in terms of power concentration, of political control over the same, greater homogeneity, greater discipline, greater professionalism to one degree, but properly, like more uniform in order, in a way that, of course, escaped most, especially pre-industrial society. So that even when you look at the Renaissance, as we've seen in multiple videos, it's not like we're looking at armies that were fundamentally different from the ones of the previous centuries. On the contrary, there are some characteristics, I prepared a video about this, that especially in size and in constitution, yes, that were pointing towards a different direction from before, because armies never remain the same. But let's say in the political and social fundamentals, the mid-14th to mid-17th century armies were practically sharing the same basis, right? And so it's not even just about, Machiavelli that we should look at to understand mercenary warfare and or the ways in which it was depicted. There is really an entire era of medieval warfare that has been instead supplanted at large by this nonsensical notion of the military revolution and all this garbage that we could do without, frankly, by this time in historiography. If there was any revolution, frankly, at least understood in the way the proponents of this idea that eventually ended up self-criticizing themselves for it, is exactly from the moment they claimed that this ended. Right, it's literally from the mid-17th century that there is a booming, a taking off that is macroscopic in nature, and frankly, in the previous centuries, that had really not happened. On the contrary, like there is a gross underestimation of medieval warfare by sheer scale. Right, most, like if you look at certain parts of Europe, late 13th, beginning of the 14th century, they were fielding armies that were much larger and much more collectively trained at large than the ones of the early 16th century. If you consider especially how they different in fundamentals, and how there was also different uniformity, say distribution in the uniformity of collective training. As always, the problem is our own. It's not the problem of Petrarch and Machiavelli that were in many ways accurately representing their own times, while still morally criticizing certain aspects of the same. And we should be really more humble towards those who preceded us. Excuse me, I drink a little. So, this is even more evident in a sense towards the Romantic era, when the realm of humanistic culture encompassing the lordships and principalities of Italy was swept up in a harsh moralizing wave of criticism for reasons that frankly were just connected to social Darwinism and pseudo-scientific racism, to mask the fact, by the way, that those eras were far more advanced than most of the Europe that, according to those same criteria, should have just been ahead, and actually wouldn't be for multiple centuries, to say the least. So that's yet another massive page that I will surely discuss further, because by this point in my sort of YouTube career, let's put it in this way, I have ever more striking indicators of the complete distortion that has been made, aside from what I publish about searching for bibliographical references and getting the full picture of how certain topics were treated. We haven't properly gotten things right in a broader sense. There is a massive disproportion in national attention. Just today I was looking at this through the tags of a famous journal from a stuff they published within about medieval warfare that I'm also going to publish into, that I think are sort of self-evident, a radical and inexplicable disproportion in favor towards countries that were notoriously not as advanced as others at the time. And that you can, and within the same Europe, by the way, this is not something like, the left is making the sense, no, we should go start studying what, I don't know, they were doing in Malaysia because otherwise we're not diverse enough. No, I'm talking literally within the boundaries of Western Europe, and not realizing that the macroscopic indicators having always been there, even within historiography. It's not something you have to dig to restudy to sort of find new evidence for it. It's all there. Just if you had only studied it, if you had only decided to give a look to it, instead of narrowly focusing on just this and that and this hyper-specialistic nonsense that we're all sinking into today, like you would actually have also an adequate military culture. That's the same reason why people are practically literate from a strategic point of view. And at all levels, right? I do not know any exception, right? Not even military analysts at large understand very much of the broader picture. They could sort of attract people for the specifically concentrated amount of knowledge given a specific situation. But the bigger picture very often is what they completely ignore, and not in the sense you really, this person is stupid, does not. No, these are people that are dramatically more intelligent than the average person, but still do not have broader cultural references to things that, again, the masses completely ignoring their tweets or whatever. This has nothing to do with what people may imagine to put forward. Conspiracy zero. Like they don't even know that they exist, because that's also the risk. Like the fact that, again, as we were saying before, like people make self-sabotage of their own civilization just because they feel threatened by elite standards, and the elite definitely exists in the establishment. It's not just, the tiny element of essentially an economic or media elite that we're discussing here. It was like that just at the time. It is traditional European identity based on that kind of elite concept, surely not about the commoners, especially at this time in history. Now, curiously, the adventurers in historiography faced accusations of being merciless towards civilian populations, yet they were simultaneously faulted for not spilling enough blood on the battlefield. It's not even like this was not real, right? In part, you would find situations in which the soldier, as you know, was not particularly tender toward average people. At large, also people today have this strange understanding of, at least this strange misunderstanding of history where they project their kind of, for example, contemporary national identity as if, if you went back in the 15th century, people, including the whole hierarchy, cared about each other because they were part of the same country. They didn't give a blip about that, right? It was mostly a caste-based system. There were surely feelings for that national identity that people did see themselves in that. But at large, slaughtering lesser people was completely normal on a regular basis, simply on that kind of difference in quality level of the human being that was rigidly ingrained in those times hierarchies, and it was also frankly justified by the constant political upheavals that took place in those systems on a regular basis. For not mentioning the fact that there was indeed this is not just about mercenaries, this is about the military class as it existed at the time, surely tributing some recognition, some sort of mutual identification on the basis of their status, right? That had been an international thing pretty much Europe-wide since the Carolingian era, right? If I am a knight, I'm a knight everywhere, and I'm preferable to anyone who was not a knight, that is, even when doesn't come from the same country we're talking about here. So there is this notion, especially in contemporary thought, that average people in Middle Ages were considered more, or just in positive terms, because lesser people today must feel appreciated at all costs, and they want to project again on military hierarchies, nobiliar establishments, this notion that, they would have been recognized by them, right, as their missing fatherly figures, as some people worth of consideration. And this is objectively embarrassing for everybody involved. I mean, the concept of virility laying under the very foundations of European identity are completely squashed by this fourth estate mental disturbance. The other, possibly even worse mental disturbance to some extent, is the notion that people today who are still fourth estaters or do not have any social relevance or quality whatsoever think that just by thinking in pseudo, at this point, even conservative terms, which is also largely nothing connected with actual traditional doctrine, which is a completely different, or at least it may overlap at some levels, but it's just, again, in the same level of hierarchical subordination to the actual elite ideals, just as something even below what commoners were at the time in comparison, is that if they buy this notion that they overtly say, or at least they propose themselves as conservatives, they would, if transferred back to those times, they would be the actual nobles of the situation. No, right? You're fundamentally weak, right? And you even generally weaker than fourth estaters at the time. So that self-identification with nobility is largely garbage, and it explicitly ignores the fact that not just there is a problem in the lack of order that they think mostly that gets down to. It's basically a world without hierarchy, a world without a specific authority but that today is mostly like an anti-statalistic feeling. It doesn't take into consideration the actual duty that somebody at the top of society should perform. That definitely has nothing to do from a nobiliar perspective with what people think they are today. Right, these are the same people who think, I don't know, judicial duel is a way to settle things, as if that was not actually mirroring a shortcoming in civilizational success, where you need people to literally do this to settle matters. That belongs to savagery at large, and even if power at large is a matter of settling the matter in similar ways, in fact, does not need to recur to these means that have hardly anything to do with self-sacrifice in holy combat, which is a completely different theologically and spiritually, really, say, metaphysical experience. So unfortunately, we are that severed from that, and part of the reason why I bring up this other notion is that there was the sense that the nobility just didn't shed blood. Right, this is actually a myth that is perpetrated by fourth estaters today as well. So it's the notion, look at those bastards, they wanted to share power and the others didn't have. Well, even if that had been the case, it was still the latter's fault, right? If there had been moments, there had been places where the average, citizen soldier was able to remain free and within a state, by the way, which is what most people really having sympathies towards these systems mostly don't understand, being the opposite of their, in fact, subcultural, publicly deteriorated and privatistic society they're actually thinking about. And this myth is so wrong in the measure in which it's absolutely not true that noblemen did not kill one another at war. This is just notorious if you have any basic understanding of medieval warfare, but just in the measure of, look at the losses of major battles fought during the feudal age, look at how many knights were actually killed, and the actual cyclicity of this. This is an intertwinement of bias that calls other bias, such as the notion that, for example, pitched battles were rare. Well, they actually weren't rare at all. They were rather frequent, right, across the various years. Yes, there were lots of other smaller battles that, however, and I'm one of the few people who ever studied this in his doctoral research, were at large pretty big battles as well. Like if you and they could be considered as such. Mostly the distinction is one of quality, if of course this battle is less documented than others, but there were so many sort of large encounters that simply because one author did not describe in depth, did not or not publicize it, that in many ways are actually pitched battles. First of all, people are also fixated that the Middle Ages is all about sieges for some reasons. Not like sieges were less frequent than open field engagements. And again, people do not understand this because they think about open field engagement, the big battle, right, with tens of thousands of men, and all the rest being sieges. No, there is a massive amount of clashes in between that largely take place in the open, and it couldn't be otherwise, because how do you even reach places to besiege, and how do you think that in between that there aren't clashes in open field, etc., that unfortunately have been completely removed from the picture, and that make a very consistent amount of the general losses that did include men-at-arms. Of course, men-at-arms were less likely to die than, especially the defeated side, some sort of lesser elements like the commoners, etc. But I said even just specified just here, just the losing side, because most of the fight was actually performed given the elite nature of these fighters, by the men-at-arms. And so the other forces were somehow auxiliary in nature, not less important overall. It was a combined armed tactic. So yes, of course, the men-at-arms at large were not just in battle, but in council, the establishment, the rule over these communities. However, they took a lot of losses themselves that were also incredibly high just in terms of sustainability, and that therefore show how people didn't really even care about taking them prisoner or having really no reason to kill them to begin with. And there's a very famous, perhaps the greatest sort of example of this misunderstanding from the aforementioned historiographical cliche is the so-called quote-unquote bloodless Battle of Anghiari, that I will make a video on at some point, which took place in 1440 between the Sforza and Piccinino. So this is a very famous battle in which, by the way, one of the few in which Florence won at some point, stopping the Milanese in Tuscany. And according to Machiavelli, famously enough, out of the 11,000 troops involved, including both cavalry and infantry, allegedly, only a single soldier perished. Right? Again, today I will not explain the very nuanced question of why Machiavelli was so mercenary, phobic, or at least, triggered. There was an ideal there. Machiavelli wasn't even properly a man of war himself. So you gotta understand the perspective, and some things do make sense, but he had sort of a very peculiar vision of the war. Just to counter him without further nuance, Flavius Blondus, that is another very famous contemporary Italian historian and also strong humanist in cultural terms, provides with this more credible account estimating for the same battle around 60 fatalities and roughly 400 injuries, which admittedly is not too much, like if you consider especially the amount of soldiers involved. But considering the composition of the Condottieri's armies, and especially the aforementioned protagonism of the Lances, we'll talk about them later, the men-at-arms in general, is a relevant amount of losses that immediately also invalidates from a much closer source to the events, both temporally and especially temporally, like Machiavelli can disprove. A very interesting parenthesis should be also open, given that I actually had the pleasure of researching at some point some battle accounts ex post, paradoxically here, going back in time further, more than a generation of Flavius Blondus and Leonardo Bruni, that is also credited as essentially the first truly modern historian. The way these guys would, in fact, try to reconstruct, for example, early 14th century, even late 13th century battles, and what kind of attitude they had in a broader literary, philological, historical, and also political way towards those times. And one mistake that people do today in this kind of mentality of the supermarket of sources, so that this guy says this, so it's a source, we should simply, it's it, right? That's my citation, look, I cited something, so this validates my approach to history. It's not, of course, the way to go. I'm not making the case this is how historians ever do, but I'm actually launching a trail here at people who still think that you need to cite sources on YouTube, while actually making much more important historical criticism from a professional background to give relevance to your content. If anything, it's people who do not have the capacity to understand the relevance of certain content. Here, no specific reference is made that reveal their level of incompetence and unreliability in judgment. But there is also an issue with this, because people tend to have an unequal and fundamentally unfair approach to different sources at some time. For example, Anglo-Saxon historiography places much greater importance and emphasis on scholarship in general. There's this deeply ingrained notion that if a scholar said something, we should basically take for granted what he says, or at least, evaluate him more than the same sources that he's discussing. That is to say, the scholarly criticism immediately surpasses the deeper meaning that a source can have, right? Coming from a continental background, my attitude is completely different, especially in my country, but not only. We have much greater, or actually simply a higher reverence towards primary sources, which actually opens to a greater criticism towards the same. I mean, if the notion is that you just need to be a scholar to think whatever you want about sources, you're not automatically doing too much to it. It's not saying that Anglo-Saxon historiography is particularly bad. I think there have been huge problems in the last half century. I'm not going to discuss this further, but I mostly do it as a grievance in my publishing that I'm increasingly doing in English, by the way, as well as other languages, of course, that informs really a way of thinking at large. If you focus on the primary sources, you will finally understand, of course, as a scholar, that acquiring some relevance. So it's, just a matter of balance here between the continental and the insular school, so to say, that regardless of the strict veridicity, so the mechanical quoting of and citation of the source content, there is surely a fundamental contextual reason for which that source says that by itself is to be appreciated beyond even the veridicity of the information. I mean, it's obvious that at the Battle of Anghiari, way more than a single soldier perished, so we perfectly know that Machiavelli was saying a pile of BS, and we know it because we know very well Machiavelli's work and why he was writing such a thing. On the other hand, this should didactically open to the recognition that Renaissance sources, and I say it as my favorite period, but there is an objective reason for this, is the 13th and 14th century, were much more unreliable and actually less informed, regardless of their philological or historiographical accomplishments, especially towards the classics, etc., than 13th or 14th century historiography. Right? Even Bruni, for example, that, as you know, writes from a Florentine, or at least Florentinized Aretinian background, is just very close to some events, for example, described by Compagni or Villani that belong to the golden age of the Florentine commune and the great medieval civilization that had shrunk like towards this guy's times. That actually were much more reliable, even being much older sources in perspective, and incredibly well informed than this Renaissance ones. In fact, the aforementioned Anglo-Saxon distrust towards sources mostly stems from the fact that British historiography, so also the Anglo-American one in general, tended to focus naturally more on Britain, on English history, say, which is part of what I was noticing through those tags on the aforementioned journal, military history journal. That was indeed a very courtly, princely, monarchic reality where historians were tendentially way, of course, more connected to a court and therefore much more severed from the surrounding reality, much more tied to the tyrant, so to say, which is a term that was applied, by the way, including, in part also for the way we were saying before, moralistically in the 19th century, mercenarism was despised, right? Associating, for example, the Italian condottieri to the Italian signories. We explained just recently why, for example, the term despot, tyrant is used for these polities that actually were the single most republican and in this sense egalitarian in Europe at the time. So if these were tyrants and despots, what were, I don't know, the kings of France or England or whatever. And that, however, again, just as a literary basis, historiographical basis, does explain the general distrust that I don't know, a British historiography may have had towards certain medieval sources, because their own national sources tended to be more similar to this later medieval Renaissance ones, where you look at Machiavelli, when you look at Petrarch, etc., that had fundamentally stopped being directly involved as citizen soldiers, for example, magistrates and politicians in general, literally controlling the entire system. This is the same military, the same logistics, etc., like Villani, for example, or Compagnie could do, or the same Dante, by the way, as citing here, for example, the Petrarch-Dante connection, that really knew, in fact, much more, and not only that, in the moment in which they had to write, they were writing in a context where people knew as well, and people were politically active as well, in a way that what was written and told was eventually reacting to what those people thought, and being generally, in this sense, also more accurate and reliable. But if, as we were saying before, the general bias towards these realities, for whichever national, confessional reasons in later historiography, etc., came to distort even just the validity of the sources a priori, just out of a whim, well, it's a bit of a problem to reconcile a bit, historiographical currents, generating an objective European historiography, like a shared historical vision, in a moment in which we really needed way more, especially in Europe, for our European schools. At some point, we'll have to have the same text, the same points of reference, and that can't be just a few 100 years old. They have really to dig back very much in time. So we've seen this problem of the apparent bloodlessness of, for example, Condottieri's battles. I made a video recently about the Battle of Caravaggio, for example, that was fought also close to Anghiari, temporarily speaking, where we have seen, in fact, that there weren't many losses, apparently, in this very big battle. By the way, we're witnessing 20,000 men per side. So just for saying also, medieval armies were small and still in places like, for example, northern Italy. No, and they were also by far the most advanced in terms of military organization, of actual quality, like of general expenses of the system. And even there, like we have some, Caravaggio, as we've seen, as many of the bigger battles revolved around sieges, right? And in those sieges, and for smaller skirmishes and clashes, we actually hear of a lot of people killed, even important leaders. So for the bigger battle, in the end, it was also pretty intense. We do not have too many chroniclers that are relatively detached from the picture, and sometimes biased, of particular losses among the men at arms. So now the question, if during the siege people had simply gotten killed, right, not just by bombard shots or something more clamorous, but on a regular basis in this assaults of the trenches, etc., why wouldn't we think that even in the absence of such explicit evidence, there would have not been enough dead, by the way? So it's actually an issue, really, and we should understand that warfare is warfare, that there isn't such a thing like clashing at those levels with those interests at stake and not causing death, right? There is this notion, however, that mercenary companies in this context, like the Condottieris one, had no desire to partake in excessively violent encounters. Why? Because such engagements could hasten the end of disputes and jeopardize the captain's manpower and equipment, meaning what they could and would receive from their masters, from their polities that were hiring them for the purpose. As we've seen also for the Battle of Caravaggio, doesn't seem to be excessively the case. On the contrary, there were currents within the Venetian defeat occurred exactly because the government told them to attack, and a current was fine with that, right? Within the same Venetian army, and these various condottieri, by the way, that were not really cohesive. They came from different backgrounds. It's also there the notion that it's just one condottiere that controls the entire army and can decide whether to engage or not because he's worried about his enterprise is a bit nonsensical. It's simply a matter of clash of titans. Like you can't have no losses when such forces really clash to begin with, right? So the notion that this alleged bloodlessness would have been caused by an economic concern is really ridiculous. Besides, when we look at mercenary warfare, we look also at a lot of competition, as we've just said, within the same armies, between the various captains, but also against one another. There were terrible rivalries between these leaders. There was so much at stake for the same captains. Like, again, I make examples with videos that I already made, but if you look at the one about Caravaggio, we've seen it for the Molinella, just to talk about yet another condottieri battle. You can check also others. The reward for a commander that would have crushed the enemy army in that situation was incredibly high. And the larger the army, by the way, both these clashes were pretty big for those time standards, for European standards. Again, they proved that definitely armies, and what armies, were not small at all, once again. But the bigger they were in the sense, and the more was there to gain from each other's annihilation, or at least like properly destruction in open field, to the point of, I mean, these were the battles that essentially stopped the Venetians from taking over the entire central northern Italy, right? Just like in previous clashes, the Milanese had tried to do that. And in these frangens, it doesn't seem really very realistic to presume that these armies should have basically not looked at each other's annihilation, and how to achieve that if not by destroying and killing. Actually, we have seen from those very battle plans, from the very sources, from what these very condottieris, very captains debated before, like, they were very precise intents to destroy the enemy army. Right? They weren't there just to poke at each other to say, okay, so we will stay hired and we'll keep earning without having to take too many losses. It doesn't make any sense. There were enormous rewards deriving from being the victors in these battles. And even as the smaller captains under the bigger leaders. So again, that is to be crossed out. Admittedly, we didn't make so many videos about the condottieri, which instead is such an interesting topic, as I realize also from the views I got. In general, you seem to be interested in that topic. I stress very much the importance of Italian communal, especially late communal armies, because I think they are fundamentally the single most underrated and possibly even the strongest army in the Middle Ages. But, of course, these were not just small clashes. There is to say, however, and we've seen this well in both Molinella and Caravaggio, that warfare was fundamentally different from the one of the previous centuries. It was tendentially a much more conservative one. This is true. But this is true across all over Europe. Think about the great battles of the 13th century. All cavalry formations deployed in depth, right, for the obvious purpose of smashing through the enemy lines. Nobody thinking of, okay, so let's entrench, let's dig in. Nobody did that. In late medieval Europe, not just this happens, there's plenty of field fortifications. Armies are tendentially smaller, so actually fortifications are, of course, more important in proportion, because the smaller the army, the more terrain becomes important in many ways. And so the more articulated also it can be to sustain a specific tactic of a smaller army that can be scattered across it with also sensibly defensive purpose. But for this very point, you realize that these armies are now not really deployed in depth. They're normally deployed in width, right? You don't have you have the same divisions, the same more or less organizational articulation that you're habituated to see throughout, essentially, we've seen also for antiquity, for the Middle Ages, and beyond. But they're not deployed in depth, they're deployed with a center and wings, right, as single battle lines on the wings, which did not quite exist before. Wings were normally before just, the auxiliary for infantry, etc. It's true that, say, in the 12th and the 11th century as well, it was a bit more like in the later Middle Ages, paradoxically. It was a different system, but it's not like cavalry was so powerful, like in the 13th century, the early 14th. So now, we don't have to digress on that, but this is true, for example, not just for the Condottieri, this is true during the 100 Years' War. At least it depends, because the French were much more aggressively minded and they tended to still reason in depth. But this is true pretty much in most battles of the era, all across Europe, right? In Germany, in Spain, we observed different, also very peculiar contexts like the Wars of the Roses that have very specific tactics for very specific political reasons. This does reflect a bit that moral exhaustion of the later Middle Ages in the form of, again, we're not simply going to break through, we need to preserve resources. It may have even been properly a reason, as we tend also in military analysis, in my opinion, today to see how often in warfare both sides are basically taken over by fatigue, chronic fatigue, and they're basically going nowhere on the longer run. This idea of this obsession for maneuvering, etc., that's something that also historically pertains to contexts where this is viable for some reason, and where actually exhaustion also is always such a big concern. So warfare is always more tiring than it seems for all involved. Now, passing by this because it's very interesting stuff, but it's not really today's topic. While warfare, like in these centuries, today let's talk just about the 15th, normally, demolished wealth, which is always true. Wars are overwhelmingly expensive, exactly to keep up with especially with the offensive, with the momentum that is extremely and disproportionately costly compared to the defensive. It also played a role in consolidating and redistributing it. Of course, mostly in political terms. The Condottieri, again, prospering as military entrepreneurs, through their endeavors, channeled their earnings into projects like public infrastructure or artistic works. I even made a video about the most famous Condottieri statues that are very beautiful to see. Now, in the Italy of the Humanist period, a deep link existed between mercenary combat, the structuring of territorial states, urban renewal, and the rise of innovative artistic and scholarly movements. In any case, this was so pronounced that, again, it's impossible not to see how developed the same military was, the Venetian Condotta being basically the most advanced army of the era, together with the band of ordnance of the Duke of Burgundy. There is another lesser-known aspect that at some point we will deepen. That is, remarkably, outright crusades were declared against free companies at some point. In part because in the moment of greater disorder, again, especially the second half of the 14th century, we've seen it very well in France. That was really the messiest, even than Italy, because in Italy you had at least, some scattered order across the territory, and even bigger armies really still were, not just from the company side, but sort of were bonding with some specific local polities and their military with pretty clear mandates, right? In France, it was just, especially after the disasters of, major battles like Poitiers, the capture of the king, the Jacquerie. You have these enormous territories without much of a local defensive capacity, exposed to so many different men that parcel the territory just to sack it, to loot it, to lord over it, in the absence of a strong monarchic authority left, right? So at a real disaster, in spite of the fact that France will still manage to keep together again from the northern power that had really controlled this much bigger Gallic reality. Thus, it was obvious that certain bands of mountaineers were targeted also for moral reasons. This is particularly true in the 12th century, where, as you know, many Brabançons were also Cathars. There was all a countercultural feeling among these troops that very often were also the expression of social malaise. They had classist revanchism. They wanted essentially they were communists at some point. They wanted to kill just the count, the bishop, and do basically whatever they wanted until they were put down like rabid dogs. And at the same time, you have at least plans, this is true for the later Middle Ages, to enlist the same free companies as crusading forces, dispatching them, for example, to Asia Minor, like in the siege of Smyrna, and the Balkans, to confront the Turks and rid Europe of their threat, even though not very successfully, as you know, from Nicopolis and Varna. For example, Malerba, that was a German free company commander in early 14th century Italy, was defeated by the Milanese army outside at the Battle of Parabiago. These were mostly Germans who had remained jobless after the Florentine-Venetian victory against Verona. I made a video about that, both for Milan and Verona, because that's where the connection is. And this guy basically made a vow to expiate his defeat. It's important to notice how relevant to them being defeated was. You would think that this was an amoral world where these free companies just did whatever they want. Other typical contemporary fortestator nonsense. It's not like there wasn't counterculture, but the leaders were knights. These people were as aristocrats. Doesn't matter how poor at some point they could be, like the backbone of the system. They commanded. Like this is like, I don't know, in the Renaissance, the emperor could have the Landsknechten hired even among Protestants, not giving a damn about them. These were the same people who were sabotaging the Catholic Empire, but Charles V, of course, would hire them anyway, because these people also would fight for the emperor anyway, right? And this is still typical. I mean, how many people today, I don't know, are fighting in armies just for practical reasons, while, for example, disagreeing maybe the political mandate that they have from both sides, right? This kind of always happens. And it shows you how many overlapping factors, down to a personal level, could exist to go at war, or at least to make something out of it from your personal perspective, because there is the bigger wave. In fact, the same Malerba that again is defeated and humiliated by it decides to go fight and actually die against the Turks at the siege of Smyrna. That is also pretty black chapter we will discuss at some point in Crusaders history. The same goes for, I don't know, even the flower of French chivalry from France, from say Burgundy as the states that were sort of evolving from within the same France and the Holy Roman Empire at that point. It's not really about free companies. Like, at least free companies would be hired, because as we will understand better now, as it is also notorious, these armies at large were constituted by mercenary companies. That's also why before I was stressing the fact that if you go back a couple of 100 years, the same knights that participate as soldiers to the bigger armies of the Universal era, they're still basically free companies, right? So not much really changed, but we somehow decided to dramatize the 14th and 15th century of the basis of mercenaries, mostly from the 19th century nationalistic, statalistic perspective. When, by the way, you can be a mercenary from one country still serving that country, except at this point there isn't such a thing like exactly the same national countries. We're just exemplifying here between what happened between France and Burgundy, for example, even though that house was the same one of the Capetians, the Valois, that ruled the same France. So it's way more complicated, but this tells you how sort of confused we decided to get and how much we have bent our historical vocabulary and broader imagination to concepts that did not really apply at the time in the way at least we think they did. Because many people deny also that there were national reasons that, I don't know, surely mercenaries at some point were not particularly loyal, but also, again, how loyal were subjects in general, right? And again, if you don't have a political or social understanding of the context, it's a bit difficult to explain why this even happened. Again, if you have been raised just in the conventionally 20th century, that is now already an old thing compared to the complete oblivion of the younger generations. It's a bit difficult to understand anything, of course, even of the present, by the way. So free companies, in this sense, were more present than we realize, right? It's true that there was an attempt, sort of a scheme, to frame them, to order them, to discipline them. Again, there is an abyss, as I was saying before between freebooters and, I don't know, Statal Condottieri forces. Really an abyss, right? So we can't even say it was unfeasible to discipline free companies. The same term free companies is not really even necessarily correct. There were many ways to describe this phenomenon at the time from the sources, the terminology, right? And in fact, what we realize here is that such companies remained as a military resource until modern states devised other approaches such as alternative mercenary systems, rather, next to the standing armies. And in substance, in fact, so much does not really change, even with the Renaissance. They're always the same companies, just there is more money around because states have concentrated more power, but fundamentally it's the same old ancien regime that exists, especially in those fundamental balancing factors since the late medieval crisis. And just a mere continuation of medieval warfare, right? Truly until the 18th or even the 20th century, depending on where in Europe. Now, to be explicit, this is not to imply that the free companies weren't a burden of the society of their era either. These men at large, as it was really the norm at the time, did not really have a distinction between civilian and military life. At least this was tendentially, exactly with the crisis, paradoxically, the disarming of large amounts of population, the professionalization of warfare, like outline in itself, but it still did not exist. It would not exist until the contemporary era, really, and the nation state. In fact, as we were saying before, hence the mercenary thing. So we have this idea that was the noble knight that was just serving the country, right, his nation. Then the mercenary was just, a mother blipper that was just there for the money and killed everybody because it was a son of a blip. No, right. They were very, very often the same people, and in this sense, with the same, in part conflicting, shared values in between. I mean, you could definitely love your country and still massacring people along the way. We have plenty of information of this about the Middle Ages. And again, yes, because mostly society was differently balanced, but really in the mentality of the era, especially if you were a professional soldier, especially if in some ways you were alienated from any other lifestyle that wasn't a military one, you would behave in pretty criminal fashion. We do really have, there are beautiful studies about this. For example, cases of, these documents produced by tribunals that were judging some criminals, some of these mercenaries that were soldiers of the local, hired by the local policy that had killed someone, even maybe just in a brawl. I mean, not because they were sadistic or whatever. And you find here, for example, their comrades saying, look, this guy seemed to me like, after all, not such a bad person or whatever. And even these comrades are described like this was a man of honor, reputation, whatever. So that gives you a dimension of how varied the world really was, based on the actual, let's say, the overall recognized quality of the individual, right? Additionally, the life of an adventurer was hardly a glamorous one. In general, this is true for all pre-industrial society, even if fighting was perhaps a better option if you had the mindset, the capacity, the means, than being a peasant. The possibility of enriching yourself were actually pretty scarce at large, or at least they would follow the normal average of the times, which was pretty ridiculous, given the potential represented by the crop yield was pretty low, right? So you could fight for a lifetime. We've seen this also for some videos about, I don't know, the Landsknechten, etc. Those were even, in worse conditions. Here we're still in a sort of feudal context, at least in a knightly retinue, etc. There is a different relation with the officers, their relative extraction, etc. But of course, especially in the second half of the 14th century, just in the most shattered, especially in the 50s, in the 60s, so that the most dramatic moment after the Black Death, freight companies really roamed Europe, causing devastation, terrible things. Like we often remember just the French theater, also the Italian one, but incredibly brutal things were going on in Germany, in Scandinavia, pretty much everywhere. The crisis had been terrible for everybody involved. Right? In Eastern Europe, they had more Mongols than before, for example, or at least even a regression of civilization to an extent. In Spain, there were still the Moors. The Ottomans arrived in the Balkans, as we were pointing out. So we tend, fortunately, like just to document, we have that available, the most advanced parts in Europe. But if you look at the Celtic fringe, that those Gallo-Glegs, they still chopped each other to pieces, like in hand-to-hand foot combat on a regular basis, living in those sort of weird, isolated rocks in the middle of nowhere as a normal basic of belief. Just imagine what kind of mindset a person brought up in these circumstances could have, which also made them pretty good mercenaries, by the way. As we see also throughout, for example, the early modern age, notoriously, the Celtic fringe provided many mercenaries in some of the largest wars of the year, and most famously the 30 Years' one, but not only. There is a lot of cosmopolitan character of these free companies that we have seen in that video we recently made about them. They came from so many different places in Europe, and while some provinces were sort of more suitable because they were mostly mountainous areas, etc., like the general impoverishment of the system after the financial cracks, the Black Death, etc., would just always allow for some desperate to be fielded, some chances to be given to him against the promise, by the way, of loot and some kind, in fact, of social, if anything, of survival for those time standards, but also some kind of promotion, maybe at the service of a specific mercenary captain. You could make a fortune for your own standards, and that was still seen as a valid motivation. But going back, for example, to the bigger picture, some of these companies were heavily developed, very institutionalized, very central in politics. Today, again, we stick to the 15th century. So The best examples in many ways are the Sforzes, the Malatestes, the Montefeltros. These are, the top Condottieri families of the year that are quite interestingly rising through the ranks in different ways. I mean, the Sforzes emerged literally from the peasantry. At some point, in a couple of generations, they came to rule Milan, and that's also an interesting perspective, by the way. By this point, the Condottieri are virtually all Italian. That changed literally in the 70s and the 80s of the 14th century, as before the free companies were foreign. That is interesting because it shows you how actually from those decades the system had rebalanced, and the local communities could simply draw also from local mercenaries in ever more functional ways. But as we will see in other videos about these military lineages, for example, the Malatest, the Montefeltro were very ancient military lineages which had emerged from the highly militarized Italian political space, in some cases from very feudally hardcore Apennine lineages that had literally specialized from centuries in their generations to be warbanders and to specialize, in fact, into military service at the head of some of the largest communes and later regional states in Italy, even reforming the local armies in virtue of their experience. The Papal States here, that's mostly the Emilian, the Romagnol areas that were very sort of warlike, in part because they had been actually less developed, or at least more fragmented than other ones. That's also why, for example, the Papal States technically did have at large the largest condottieri pools. This is very true for Romagna, but also for Umbria, from the Roman nobility. Had the Papal States sort of united in a more functional sense, like, I don't know, the Milanese duchy, they would have surely taken over Italy. That, however, why probably they had so many good mercenaries, because they had sort of more primitive forces agitating within it as a consequence of the fact that the Papal States were sort of more scattered dominions compared to the more orderly and sort of modern Milan at that point. It was, however, a sort of militaristic state. In fact, they had the best polity in Italy in terms of political control, etc. They will also be the first one to fall during the Italian War, so that's interesting in many ways. The Venetians had other approaches, right? They were also very advanced, but they were not so uniform as the Milanese in administration, etc. But this is something, again, we will see better for in other videos. These were princely tycoons, basically, the leading stars of mercenarism. Below them existed a throng of impoverished individuals, those scraping by through sheer grit and desperation, which, of course, we do not know much about either, because aside from, of course, the fairly well-known plethora of second-rank captains that, again, are very well documented in this context, there were the humble final rank soldiers that we do not know the name of, but that really made the whole thing work as well, together with the men-at-arms that, again, at large all came from aristocratic families. In fact, I made a video last year which I explained exactly this, how throughout all the late Middle Ages and basically the modern age, but also before, like the sense that the armies were essentially run, even when composed of peasants, of even those who fought against knights, etc., were composed, arrayed, trained by knights. Knights were everywhere. They were the military gold standard. They knew what to do. They were the only true professionals who knew. By the way, it's the other great myth of the era. They didn't know the potential of infantry. They were so fanatic, but that's also a completely contemporary notion. It's not like the French knights even before Crécy, Poitiers, Azincourt did not know the potential of infantry or even English infantry. This is complete BS, right? And actually they fought pretty well against them exactly because they knew what their potential was, regardless of the outcome. That is also a thing out there. Somebody must lose anyway. And it's not like they were idiots because of that. Just a contemporary person would actually be by thinking it instead. But there are some very picturesque names. Here I have a passage that I would like to read you because it's very interesting. About the ill-fated captain, we're still among Italian condottieri, Francesco Cento Ossa, that literally means Francis 100 bones, and thus whose name, or more accurately nickname, speaks volumes about what kind of human types this kind of were. Pretty frightening ones. There is all an art, for example. I will surely make a video at some point about specific paintings that show you things like, I don't know, condottieri in arms, but say with, the hit, like the traces of the blows that they received on armor, the scars, right? So being quite graphically honest about what that lifestyle entailed. And this Cento Ossa crossed paths with a Florentine Dominican near Ferrara in 1475 during a journey of the friar that provides with this vivid, almost humorous depiction of a mercenary commander in Cento Ossa. And so I simply read it, then we will comment it. Now, on a certain Tuesday morning, around 10 o'clock or thereabouts, after I had performed Mass for the well-being of Brother Jerome from Ferrara, who was sick in the convent and had fervently implored me to do so, I departed. Following my usual habit, I journeyed by cart to Francolino, a 5-mile trip, intending to catch a boat there headed for Venice. My arrangements were proceeding splendidly as there were numerous boats at hand and the wind was ideal for the voyage to Venice. However, an unexpected hindrance emerged in this way. As I stood waiting to step aboard, a band of roughly 50-foot soldiers, also bound for Venice, showed up, led by a captain of armed troops named Francesco Cento Ossa. He served the Signoria and was en route to Albania to assist a city called Scutari, where the forces of the detestable Turk had set up camp. Reflecting on how vastly different the lives of soldiers and religious figures are, and wishing to avoid any chance of them troubling me during the trip, particularly since I overheard their vulgar and dishonorable remarks, consistent with their entrenched and deplorable customs, I wavered over whether to join them or not. Yet what truly stopped me and solidified my decision to avoid traveling with them was this. Their vile captain, seeking to rent 3 boats for himself and his group, but failing to settle terms with the boat owners, erupted into a furious outburst. He blasphemed shockingly, repeatedly defiling the body and blood of our Savior Jesus Christ with complete disdain, until he sank into such derangement and mental darkness that with a haughty look he clasped his hands, lifted them along with his gaze to the sky, an act so dreadful and chilling even to contemplate, describing and damned the glorious Virgin Mary, Queen of Heaven, Empress of the world, Mother of our Savior and Redeemer Jesus Christ, with numerous vile and disgraceful epithets, which out of respect I'd rather not record than spell out. Hearing those words pierced my heart with profound grief, and I kept anticipating some divine retribution to strike this cruel and wicked man. When he stepped onto the boat, it felt to me as if the craft might overturn, as though the water itself couldn't support such wickedness upon it. Now, this is beautiful because it does give you really that deep countercultural, you see here, even anti-Catholic, anti-divine, but not atheistic, maybe antitheistic, but still taking the stance against God, kind of bravado and frustration, sort of a lesser element, like somebody by the way, commanding foot troops. We're in 1475, and infantry is definitely very important here. Again, these guys are departing to the Balkans to fight against the Ottomans. This is after the fall of Constantinople. Venice naturally is very involved there. So what is interesting is, of course, how this guy seems to be here, aside from the fact that it's a Franciscan friar writing, but he would have not thought the same had this commander been of a different mold, right? So it's not like he talks much badly about the infantry troops, but he says, of course, that they are living in a wickedly entrenched reality where, of course, they sin in a broader sense. There is this idea at a point that may actually come from the same here Franciscan as Friar Minor's sense of perception of the world from the lower part of the hierarchy, that the nature of power is wicked. So he goes against even these practices that soldiers would have still believed in terms of what they can gain to fight against an enemy. By the way, like the Ottomans, that surely the same Franciscan here, in fact, treats as as a pest, as they were. Thus, this recount is pretty much mirroring in part that exhaustion, that derangement, that almost absurd reality of the late medieval world, right? Exhausted in deep moral ways, mostly through even the recognition that there's a weak nature of power, those who should embody the same. And so the Franciscan is not really criticizing. Yeah, he's actually criticizing soldiery at large, but it's not like he would have just had a negative opinion, I think, about any kind of earthly power. Just his perspective may have been, especially against this kind of soldiery. I thought this was an interesting aspect to browse. And again, we've seen how in other eras, the denial of divinity, or at least a counter-divine attitude, is often part of the soldier. Think about Arianism among the Germanic warriors in late antiquity, during the migration era. They basically stated, a bit like Protestants later, that was no divinity, no divine nature in Christ. So they were basically denying, together with that, the element of it within humanity as well, that according to tradition can provide with, salvation, at least through merits, through works. It's not random that the Germans would choose that. Their elites would, in fact, be much more immediately available to Catholicism at large, regardless what was at stake within their same establishment. This factionalism could have been an excuse devoid of many other theological concerns. But in this regard, the idea of saying, I fight against God from a soldiery perspective, it's something paradoxical, right? Here we are in 1475, but just as it's going to happen in a few generations with the Reformation, what's the point of being a soldier, for example, in a Protestant? How could, the Landsknechten, for example, and their sense of imperial soldiery match with Protestantism, with the denial of the works, with the essentially the nullification of the individual in an existential purpose from his own active standpoint, right? Because there were specific rituals still connected with being a soldier that were evidently being diluted in traditional meaning in front of people that, as we explained also in other videos, were sort of losing the same prestige connected with the bearing of the cingulum militaris. There's so much to browse in this, because up to, like, this was still very felt, for example, among those who participated to military orders, the word nobleman, throughout also the modern age that existed at the time. There was an idea of sacred soldiery, of sacred militia, of sacred knighthood, that evidently this infantry commander did not quite embody, as all those were all Catholic orders in the truly military meaning of the term. This is an aspect that we will have to keep browsing, because it's as if historically we thought that, history just happens, like before here there is the 15th century is in kind of one way, and then there's kind of the Renaissance, and things change, like things happen for non-clearly consequential reasons, mostly based on the behavior of polities that we treat as autonomous beings, as if they were, single people. We don't understand how throughout this world system were both changes that are much greater than say, much more numerous within than one sort of monofactorially influenced policies, and also so much continuity instead. And we just see history just changing chapter, just like on the history manual itself. It's not like this. We'll have to talk again about this especially countercultural element that gradually sabotaged and weakened the awareness of the sacred in Catholic power, right? And maybe reinforce certain contingent realities that had up to that point been kept under, not fully expressing themselves outside of the corporative hierarchy of the empire, etc., hence Protestantism and so on, and that also were not even that particularly successful on the longer run. In any case, from a military standpoint, just to close a bit with France now, one could argue that the Middle Ages, still lingering in the mercenary companies with their commercial nature sometimes, and the knightly aspirations as well that frequently occupied their members' thoughts, were firmly overtaken once military service for both nobles and commoners was regulated, its traits specified, and its pay established. This is the other great phenomenon of the era, the actual strengthening of polities, of states, of permanent institutions, including the military ones, which is in part the consequence of the broader exhaustion of the masses, the consolidation of an actually elite power. There is, as I always say, no greater lie at any point here to pretend that the Renaissance brought up a greater individual liberty of people. This is absolutely wrong. It did not happen. If anything, it's the other way around. The elite reinforced itself. Even the foot soldiers you start seeing here, the pike squares, etc., challenging cavalry, are still used effectively by princes, by people who were the only ones who had enough power to field them, also with the security of not being overthrown in a revolution, for how strongly powerful this traditional order and social stratification of the cases really was at this point. To never make that silly mistake that is also part of this weird narratives, mostly anti-Catholic ones, looking at modern history that do not find any evidence whatsoever, if not in the atheistic sort of climax after the Protestant Reformation is something, however, happening later. Like the early modern age is very, very as traditional as it gets, at least in terms of social stratification. In any case, that's when there were bigger powers than the individual companies that, in fact, by themselves really went nowhere. Right? This is a very interesting aspect of the war. It's not like those ravaging companies of the second half of the 14th century settled somewhere, created feudal states. They said, like, this had been happening a lot. Think about the Normans back in the day. Think about the same migration era. Here it's basically all the same phenomenon, except these war bands go nowhere. They often return home without also much practically accomplished. It's really a moment of chaos and of lack of purpose in a broader moral sense. This is, again, the moment in which universal authorities fade, in which people feel lost. That's also in part why they delegate directly or indirectly. Doesn't matter whether they were threatened or not. They were the ones giving up their arms because they said, I don't want to pay for war. And they got taken over by others in the process. That's how it literally happens. Always those pacifistic, socialistic movements at the end of the day tend to pretend that war is bad per se, because they want to distract from the fact that they are actually the bad guys to begin with. Lesser people, common people, are the bad guys. For the elite, there can be exceptions. In any case, the establishment of the more accomplished is better. People are always vile and cowardly instead. In any case, also the rise of firearms and the increasing prominence of infantry compelled a swift discarding between the 14th and 15th centuries of what remained of outdated and insufficient systems. You needed ever more robust systems, ever more professional ones, hence also why, of course, people, against their statal paranoia, the state exists because you're a lesser people. I don't know if you realized, but if you complain that there's be less state, well, yeah, that's good if people are actually qualitative in nature. If there is less state, there's being created to cope with the fact that it's plenty of lesser people we have to somehow maintain parasitically. Everything crumbles, primarily lesser people. That's always why during revolutions, people always lost power in relative terms, and this never really went much beyond, even in terms of moral improvements, to say the least. This is basics of history of politics and society, but for some reason we don't teach them in schools yet. But even just to field bigger armies with artillery trains, like, you needed much more concentrated power before you would have a greater participation of universal forces, even in much less statally developed realities. And let's not exaggerate, again, even how here the gradual bureaucratization of the system, at least by medieval standards, is and the tendential centralization or power concentration is is simply more effective than 13th, 14th, early 14th century states, right? Armies, again, are not actually bigger than those times. There are also, however, phenomena of regional recompaction, given the moving away, again, from universal systems, or at least a much longer range involvement, again, all a consequence of the crisis. And so you have the further consolidation of more neatly established national monarchies that are just the product of the failure of the bigger power to actually benefit everyone, with everybody's loss in the moment in which, in fact, this fragmentation that always entails this level of narcissism from the national to the individual. Anything that does not look to God and to absolute power is weak by definition. A crucial initial move towards establishing standing armies occurred in France near the close of the 100 Years' War, under Charles VII. I made properly a video about the Compagnie d'Ordonnance under this king. That was essentially the guy who, as you know, witnessed the end, brought to the end of the 100 Years' War, and found himself with a country to rearrange. It would be mostly his son, Louis XI that I also discussed that began the actual recompaction, re-extension, say, of the French monarchy, also against its neighbors. In 1445, abandoning the traditional feudal collab known as the ban and the broader levy, the arrière-ban, Charles VII formed about 15 Compagnies d'Ordonnance, ordnance companies, each comprising 100 lances. Now, a lance, as you know, was a fighting unit, though its makeup and precise organization differed slightly across regions and shifted over time. Per the agreement, the condotta made in 1432 between Florence and Micheletto degli Attendoli, for instance, each lance was to consist of unum, I'm reading, unum caporalem, unum equitatorem sive piactum, et unum pagium, cum duobus equis et uno ronzeno, that is to say, translating to a heavily armored knight supported by another mounted fighter and an attendant equipped with 2 horses and a pack horse. But again, it varied. I made multiple videos about lances, about the professionalization of these military systems, requiring, again, different arrangements within. There is also the how did this cavalry eventually cooperate with infantry, were lances that had basically 12 elements within them, and we will come back on this. In fact, in other places, here just an Italian example, but the setup varied. The form that eventually became standard, however, in the French case, was the lance fournie, including 6 mounted men, the heavy knight among them, with 3 or 4 being active combatants. From that point, heavily armed knights started being called gendarmes, so literally people of arms, men at arms, actually, or simply, hence, gendarme, right? Still today is the gendarmerie in France is basically the consequence of that. And I think it's quite, of course, like the French Revolution happening between, so the meaning, at least what this is reference to, changed a lot. However, it really derives from these times, and I would say it's worth remembering. Within the Compagnie d'Ordonnance, the French aristocracy of the 14th, 15th century managed for a period to blend the old markedly distinct idea of chivalric brotherhood in arms with the emerging notion of allegiance to the crown, at least in vague terms. Again, these companies were just the same ones had always existed before, so that kind of aristocratic military lifestyle was ingrained in the system. As such, they would, of course, develop a further attachment to the national cause, especially during the 100 Years' War. Again, I made videos explaining how these companies were de facto created. Again, these were companies that were essentially not disbanded for the bad season and kept in service, right? And or also some of the best ones were maintained, others were disbanded. So there was nothing strictly specific about them, right? The concept of uniformation, even in strictly modern terms, wasn't there. But this was a way, at least, to be now more reliant on the crown, especially for pay, which was always a bit like the point, how do you keep this soldiery fit? Also because here we're not in the age of barracks, of parade grounds yet. Like, we are in a moment in which these troops are billeted. They are living basically out there on their own. They have essentially to provide with their own equipment and or with one that is still not uniformed, is dependent on the supplies. Like these companies were essentially billeted in some towns that would thus have to cooperate with them as far as the military equipment was concerned. They acted as garrisons in the military situation of the 100 Years' War. Like, they had to defend especially northern French centers from the chevauchée of the English and their supporters. So they made sense, as you understand here, in a less innovative fashion, but gradually taking on that character. Less effective was in fact also the attempt of form parish-based groups of archers recruited from ordinary people, the Francs Archers. We will surely make some videos at some point. We'll have to make them as military historical units episode, and that will be interesting. There were some equivalents in other countries. By the way, the French, as you know, had hired some Scottish forces before. There was the Scottish Guard, also countering effectively the English longbowmen from the French side. So it's really very instructive at large, and we never made videos on specific. We talk about the French legions. There is a video that I made about the French infantry, probably the French national native infantry of the Italian wars, that, as you know, wasn't a big thing, but was appearing after the failed, especially attempts of the legions, French legions of Francis I. Here made multiple videos on the companies in general, from a military point of view, like how they came into being historically. Here, in any case, I will get all the necessary videos in the top fix comment related videos list. And that is, but let's say, the centrality of the company throughout this era, and the fact that they corresponded to a basic, also tactical, strategical need, right, of the military organization of the time, has practically nothing to do with the, let's say, in fact, with any kind of extempore innovation in the later Middle Ages. We tend to categorize that too much. These armies simply came into being through a specific path, a specific dynamic that made them ever more permanent, right, and reliable and available. So that's basically it. You don't have to search too far, right? In any case, this is the interesting part of it all. We have an infinite amount of material if we want to discuss this thing, which we will do. As you understand here, the most crucial aspect is to sediment gradually, right? If we were to talk about just the importance of the company per se, here I think I made already 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 videos about the companies of different types, plus I think 9 with the Compagnie d'Ordonnance, or the Bande d'Ordonnance, by the way. Yeah, I mean, and there are different names that are used to describe the company historically. These were mostly, I don't have to make the history of it, you know, the Compagnia, that's the etymology, those who essentially eat the same bread together. It's a thing very old, from the time of the Masnata, of the Bucellari. They literally seem to have actually had the same etymology. And that became like a very soldierly business in a mercenary sense from the 13th century, where, however, you don't hear too much about the company per se, even though it was already, from an organic point of view, the backbone of the great feudal armies of the era, right? So, again, trying to distinguish, to sort out the mercenary, especially considering that at large, even, yes, they were multinational in some nature, but at large they were also from the same places from which the armies were recruited, makes you understand how unnecessary, from a didactic point of view, the entire notion of the mercenary as separated from the rest of the soldiers, even assuming that there can be such a separation, really is. After all, feudal lords had already been paid. You can argue since ever, because otherwise they would have not served anyway. Made lots of videos about the French army, for that matter, in much older times. So this is not, again, a radical innovation. It's just, in a sense, the political, social formula by which these forces began to coagulate in more recognizably, and in this sense just conventionally intended modern armies, in ways that still exist. I mean, the company, as you know, exists today. It's actually the most important tactical element still, because of the aside from, again, the different fluctuation in organic, because sometimes units with the same name can have literally very different sizes. It depends a bit on the country, on the military tradition, on the doctrine, etc. But fundamentally, there is a basic standard whereby the company commander has enough men, so many men at his disposal as the ones he can individually know to rely on in a tactical situation. That's basically it. It's a limit. It's a mental limit, humanly wise. That is to say, the number of people you can fundamentally remember, mnemonically speaking, as a command. Excuse me, because towards the end of the videos I'm often distracted to the level I'm looking at other things. Alright, let's not worry about this now. But I don't know how liked these videos are, because I sometimes think that really the type of views I get are increasingly connected with the thumbnail rather than anything. But these are very important topics that I hope to cover in a way that is useful for the understanding of the art of war, because that's, at the end of the day, what we're mostly into. And I believe that we should definitely continue discussing these topics in ways that recompact sort of all the threads, right? Reunite all the threads of the single stories. Right, by this time on Schwerpunkt, I can't say we have covered satisfactorily the basis of everything, but let's say we are surely arrived to a point which you can move to so many different topics that are fundamentally interconnected. So there is a web that can and will really solidify further thanks to this. And I count on you, especially through the related videos, comments, to essentially go search for the most pertinent and closest video, really, topic that I already provided. And this stuff that I'm aware of is never discussed online. If you look at other videos, other channels, let's say, let's make an experiment. Now I will essentially guess what I will find. Essentially, I will find modern military companies. Right, I mean contemporary military companies, like at this military company or military company in this other context, whatever, in this or that today's army. And I will search military company on YouTube, and is there going to be, from, I don't know, Kings and Generals or the stuff, a video about the military companies? Well, maybe from them, but I don't think I'm going to find so much in terms of the company. Right, the regiment, for example, is going to be probably more out there, but the company in this late medieval sense here is not very. In fact, here, first of all, I get, of course, all contemporary warfare. I can't see, which is also kind of understandable by a degree. And then I started having the Patriot, Battle of Camden, kind of true size of a company in 1944. Then I understand this. It sort of makes sense. I would find more mostly contemporary warfare. It's not even about the company in other times. And so I would search here, because in English you tend to consider modern just by saying today's modern company. In fact, here I see the modern mercenary companies even, but no early modern, say, Renaissance military company. The golden age of free companies is Condottieri, the White Company, Warriors for Hire, and it's basically it. There's just my own videos. And so it doesn't talk about companies at all in this broader cultural sense, military cultural sense. It's just about, this, the big topic of the golden age of free companies, 18 minutes. Like, I could make videos about this stuff. The Condottieri as well, which here is depicted in weird ways. And yeah, it's just for some specific hits and not much more. It's a pity. Medieval military company. Probably more. Not much. Not much, actually. So yeah, this is basically not even truly considered. This thing I can't tolerate. How did medieval soldiers level up and get war gear? Oh god. They're treating stuff like video games, really. Very well, anyway. Here I'm looking at with dread that, of course, in thumbnails they use copyrighted images. If such bigger channels do it, I don't think there is anything wrong against it. The evolution of medieval armor, because of course, such an important topic while searching medieval companies. What can you do here? Well, that's it. Yesterday I made a video, as you know, about commentaries on other videos, but we have to become a bit more. We have to become viral to begin with. It's not easy. Let's make it work over time. We'll surely keep talking about all these topics together for today. However, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.